We'll start with this. Here's something you probably didn't hear about. A few months ago, a region of our country was gripped by a natural disaster, devastated by it. That region is Eastern Kentucky. It was flooded, entire neighborhoods, towns underwater. Here's some footage from WHAS in Kentucky. As you can see there, I mean, it looks biblical. Everything underwater, right? And you never heard about this, did you? And that's not your fault. If you don't live in the area, if you don't live in Kentucky, the national media doesn't talk about it, then how are you going to hear about it? Here's an account from one man, a trailer park resident, who lost everything in the floods. And here's what he has to say. Listen.
I walked outside and saw everything that it was already up, and I knew it had to be deep already, up to my knees at least. And I came through the house and told my wife, don't freak out, but we got to get out here right now. We got to get the kids out. And I carried 2 kids in the van, got her in the van, drove over there, and I was freaking out. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I could do was just try to run over here and grab anything that I thought was sentimental and we possibly couldn't buy back. I lost everything. Everything it took us years to build is gone. One night, one day, rebuild, try to find somewhere safe where my kids won't have to go through that again. And start off small, make it back somehow.
Now, why didn't you hear about this? Well, because it's Eastern Kentucky. This is happening mostly to poor white people in trailer parks. And the media simply doesn't care about poor white people in trailer parks. And when I say poor, I mean poor. I think the word poor almost doesn't quite capture the situation for many people that live in that part of the country. Now, as I tell you about Eastern Kentucky, I'm going to put up on the screen some pictures taken by Shelby Lee Adams, a photographer. These were published in an article in NPR a few years ago. These are not pictures from the 19th century. This is life in Eastern Kentucky today. 9 of the poorest counties in the entire nation, 9 of them are in this one little small part of the country, Eastern Kentucky. The poverty rate in one county, Owsley County, is 45%. That's nearly half. Nearly half of the residents are in poverty. Across the entire Appalachian region, the poverty rate is almost 20%. The average income is $37,000 across the entire region. In Eastern Kentucky, it's $30,000. That's $16,000 less than the average income nationally. In 2014, the New York Times Magazine tried to compile a list of the places in the country with the worst quality of life. And according to this calculation, the worst place in the country to live, the worst quality of life in the entire country, is Eastern Kentucky. Let me read from their article. This is published at NewYorkTimes.com from their magazine. It says, the team at The Upshot, a Times news and data analyst venture, compiled 6 basic metrics to give a picture of the quality and longevity of life in each county of the nation: educational attainment, household income, jobless rate, disability rate, life expectancy, and obesity rate. Weighting each equally, 6 counties in Eastern Kentucky's coal country rank among the bottom 10. Clay County, in dead last, might as well be in a different country. The median household income there is barely above the poverty line at $22,000. Actually, it's $22,296. That's the median income, and is just over half the nationwide median. Only 7.4% of the population has a bachelor's degree or higher. The unemployment rate is 12.7%. The disability rate is nearly as high at 11.7%. Nationwide, the figure is 1.3%. Life expectancy is 6 years shorter than average. Perhaps related, nearly half of Clay County is obese. Later on in the article, it says, despite this, rural poverty is largely shunted aside in the conversation about inequality, much in the way that rural areas have been left behind by broader shifts in the economy. The sheer intractability of rural poverty raises uncomfortable questions about how to fix it or to what extent it is even fixable. Now, I should mention the suicide rate in Appalachia is 17% higher than the national average, which is not surprising given everything that I just read. And then, of course, here's the one thing that you probably have heard about Eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian region generally, is that it's beset by drug addiction, particularly opioid addiction. The opioid crisis has hit this part of the country perhaps harder than anywhere else. Now, why do I bring all this up? Because I have a question for you, and it's something to consider. Take a hypothetical person living in Clay County, Kentucky. Apparently, perhaps the worst place in the country to live, Clay County, Kentucky. And let's say a white child, living in a trailer park in Clay County. Father committed suicide years ago. Mother's addicted to painkillers. Household income is $18,000 a year. In a good year. He lives in a 2-bedroom trailer in a low-lying area, susceptible to flooding. According to New York Times Magazine, he has maybe the worst quality of life of anyone anywhere else in the country. Now, this is a hypothetical example, but it represents a situation that a great many children in that part of the country are in. There's nothing absurd about this hypothetical. It's not far-fetched by any means. And now the question, in what possible sense, in what specific sense, could we say that this child is privileged? We hear a lot about white privilege. We hear that all white people everywhere in the country are the beneficiaries of this privilege. And yet when we look at the reality, okay, when we look into, to borrow a phrase from the left, when we look at the lived experiences of so many white people in the country, this privilege doesn't seem to amount to very much at all. So again, where does the privilege come in for this child? When does he get to cash it in? In what particular moment of his life can we say, oh, that happened because of white privilege? What kind of privilege? What do you mean? What sort of privilege is this? He's dirt poor, so it's not economic privilege. He doesn't have access to a good education, so it's not an educational sort of privilege. He doesn't have good health care, so it's not health care privilege. There's no privilege in any of those senses. What about systemically? Does the system favor him? I think this is, in fact, what we will be told. We will be told that, okay, yeah, I mean, he doesn't have economic privilege, he doesn't have educational privilege, he doesn't have privilege in terms of his health, but he's got systemic privilege. Really? Do you think the system favors this child that we're talking about? I mean, whatever system whatever system we're referring to here, it would seem to me that all of the systems have forgotten about this child and everybody else living in that part of the country. There is just no sense in which you can say that a poor white kid in a trailer in Appalachia is favored by the system. There is no system anywhere that favors him. He is forgotten by every system. Do you think when he walks into a job interview one day, if that day ever arrives for him, which very likely it won't, but do you think if he does, as a poor Kentucky kid with a thick accent, living in poverty all his life, do you think his resume is going to go to the top of the stack? Do you think he's not going to suffer any discrimination, any negative assumptions, given his background, his economic status, his accent, his mannerisms, and so on? What employers are going to favor hiring people out of trailer parks? It would seem like none of them do, because if they did, there wouldn't be trailer parks, because all those people would have jobs, and good jobs by now. The claim of white privilege just doesn't hold up to the reality that many white people experience and live through. And in fact, I would argue that the very concept of white privilege, the very claim of white privilege, is proof that white privilege doesn't exist, because the only way you can claim it is if you have completely forgotten about and discounted the millions of dirt poor white people forgotten by the system across the country. That's the only way that the whole notion of white privilege, when you hear white privilege, your mind immediately comes to, relatively well-off white people living in the suburbs. That's what you think of as the sort of the picture of white privilege. And so we have erased, to borrow another popular term from the left, we have erased all of the white people who don't fit into that. Just, they don't count. Forgotten about them. And for this hypothetical child, who's not really hypothetical because millions of kids are in this position, for this child and for the people there, that's what they're used to. They're used to being forgotten. They've been forgotten by every single system. There is no system that is saying, let's go to those people and help them out. This is why our discussion of privilege is too simplistic. It is literally black and white, which is absurd. It doesn't work with the reality. And this is when we get into the back and forth of anecdotes. And so somebody will respond by talking about a black child growing up in the inner city and the struggles and hardships he faces. Struggles and hardships which are immense, of course. And just like the white child in the trailer park, these are struggles and hardships that for many people are insurmountable. But the problem is we could go back and forth with anecdotes all day long. You give me one, I give you one. Literally of millions of examples on both sides. Maybe that's a good signal that we're thinking about this topic of privilege all wrong. Because I personally would not want to go up to someone living in one of those trailer parks, which is now water damaged because of flooding that nobody cared about. I wouldn't want to go up to someone like that and tell them about their privilege. That's not something I would want to do. I don't know about you. So I think it's time to expand our notion of privilege. And here, because I'm not saying that privilege is non-existent. I'm not saying that privilege is a myth. I think white privilege is a myth. Privilege, though, is not. There is something called privilege. There are people who are privileged. But what is privilege? I mean, how do you get privilege? Who are the privileged people in this country? And I think that we could think of privilege in two broad categories. So there's economic privilege. We could say that someone who's born in a well-off family, a well-off community, is privileged in many different ways. You know, they're gonna get the best of everything in terms of luxuries and necessities, and they're gonna probably have good schools, and they're gonna have good healthcare, and they're gonna have access to whatever they want. That's privilege, of course. But we already have established that not every to put it mildly, this is an understatement, not every white person is economically privileged. A great many of them are not. So that is not something that can be separated by race. But then there's a deeper sense. I think there's a deeper sense of privilege. The sense in which I would say that I am privileged. I mean, I wasn't born to a well-off family or rich. I wasn't born in dirt poverty either. So I suppose I am the beneficiary of some kind of economic privilege. Just to be born in the middle class is a lot better than being born in a trailer park or being born in the inner city, economically speaking. But I'll tell you the real privilege that I had, okay? The real privilege that I had in modern society is that I was born to a household with two parents who were both living, both in the home, married, stayed married throughout my entire childhood and are still married today, by the way, cared about my well-being, cared about my education, and cared about my moral formation as a person. That is, I think, the real privilege that I inherited. And I think that's what privilege really is for most people. If you have that, if you have that going for you, then you're going to probably get a fair shake at life. And there are plenty of people in trailer parks in Eastern Kentucky or in the inner city who have that. But a great many don't. If you look at the fatherless rate, the rate of broken homes and domestic violence and domestic turmoil in the inner city and in poor trailer park areas in the Appalachia region, you're going to find that those rates are very high, much higher than they are for a lot of us. And that doesn't explain everything. I mean, if you are born to a two-parent household with parents that love you and care about you, and you live in dirt poverty, you're still going to have a lot of challenges, and there's a very good chance that you're going to be in that dirt poverty for your entire life, because it's going to be a very hard obstacle to get over even then. But even so, that is a great advantage. That's a great leg up for any kid. Now, it's kind of sad that these days we have to talk about this as being a privilege, because this should not be a privilege. This is natural. This is how it should be for everybody. This should be a given. But that's not the case. And we know that the rates of broken homes and fatherless homes are high and getting higher for communities across the country. In the black community, it's 70% about, but 70% of black kids in the inner city, it's even higher, grow up without fathers in the home. For white people, the rate is lower, but it's much higher than it should be, and it's getting higher. That's what we should be focusing on. If we really want to talk about privilege, I think these are the two areas we should be looking at. And we shouldn't be looking at them because we want to punish the people who have that kind of, someone who has the privilege, the economic privilege, or the privilege, the much better privilege, the much deeper privilege of being born to a two-parent household with loving parents. It's not like we're looking to punish them or take anything away from them to even the score. That's not the right way of approaching this. It's to look at the kids who don't have that and figure out what can we do for them so that they do have it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Matt Walsh Show. If you did, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right down there so you can stay up to date on all of our future content.